Hello everyone, and welcome to World War II at 80. I'm Ron May, your host, author, historian, and speaker on World War II history and the stories of those who served. We continue with our 12th episode today, which focuses on the events and stories of December 1944. December was one of the worst months on record during American involvement in World War II. There were tragic massacres of American POWs in both the European and Pacific theaters of war. On December 14th, over 125 American POWs were slaughtered by their Japanese captors in the Philippine Palawan Prison Camp 10A. It became known as the Palawan Massacre. Palawan is a province located southeast of the main Philippine islands, shown in red on the map. The prisoners, who were among those captured along the Bataan Peninsula in early 1942, had been sent to the Palawan prison camp where they spent the next 2 years. They were forced to undertake a grueling project, clearing land and then building a concrete runway for planes, shown with the yellow arrow, using only hand tools. They were fed one bowl of rice each day. By October 1944, Allied forces began bombing the airstrip. Due to the Allied bombings, the Japanese guards forced the prisoners to dig bomb shelters in the compound, shown with the brown arrangement of logs on the map, to be used during air bomb raids. The dugout trenches were overlaid with coconut logs for added protection. Unknown to the prisoners, the guards were under order to dispose of the men if the Allied forces got too close. On December 14th, as Allied armies advanced toward their location, Japanese guards sounded the air raid warning to get the 150 prisoners into the earthen shelters. Once the Americans were crowded inside the shelters, the guards poured gasoline on the shelter entrances of the 3 dugouts and set them on fire. They then began firing their weapons into the trapped men. The resulting fire and melee of bullets killed 125 Americans. 24 prisoners were able to escape the trap through a hidden rear exit in 2 of the shelters, shown with the green arrows at the bottom left of the map. The guards hunted them down and killed 14 of them. 11 of the prisoners who escaped made it back to the safety of U.S. forces with the assistance of Filipino scouts. A few months later, on February 28, 1945, the 8th Army landed on Palawan and took control of the island. Hearing of the massacre from survivors of the camp, they began excavating the bomb shelters. The remains of the 125 victims were discovered. Another tragic massacre of U.S. POWs took place in the snowy region of Malmedy in Belgium, where U.S. soldiers were captured by the Germans. The yellow arrow marks the location of the massacre just outside of Malmedy. It occurred on December 17th, when German Waffen-SS troops brought over 120 American soldiers who had just surrendered into a farmer's field and opened fire on them with machine guns, killing 84. The bodies of the dead soldiers remained in the snow for the next several weeks. 43 of the captured Americans escaped the massacre and hid until they could safely return to the U.S. lines and report on the massacre. About a month after the tragic massacre, on January 14, 1945, the U.S. Army reached the killing field where the German soldiers had executed the U.S. POWs on December 17, 1944, a month earlier. Military investigators photographed the war crime scene and the frozen, snow-covered corpses. The bodies were removed for autopsy and burial. The Malmedy massacre shocked the U.S. public. American soldiers of the 11th Armored Division retaliated against the Germans a few weeks later when they shot 80 German POWs in what became known as the Chenab Massacre. From May till June 1946, the Malmedy Massacre trial took place and established that the commanders in the field bore command responsibility for the Waffen-SS killing of the surrendered U.S. POWs, specifically Waffen-SS General Joseph Dietrich and SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, whose soldiers committed the actual war crime at Malmedy. Later, the Dachau trials prosecuted and punished war criminals by imposing 43 death sentences, including Peiper and Dietrich. The Malmedy Massacre Memorial Wall was later erected across the road from the field where the massacre occurred. The names of each slaughtered American appears on the wall. Bad weather added to the woes of December. Throughout December, a bitterly cold maritime polar air mass descended upon the Belgium-Ardennes-Eifel region where U.S. forces had advanced. The location there was intended to be a rest area for weary troops, but it was difficult to find rest in such miserable conditions. The North Pacific Theater was much warmer that December, but it endured its own bad weather in the form of Typhoon Cobra, which struck the U.S. Navy's Third Fleet east of the Philippine island of Luzon on December 17th. The 160-mile-per-hour winds and high waves rolled some of the ships more than 70 degrees. 3 Navy destroyers with near-empty fuel tanks because they were unable to refuel during the storm sank in the strong wind and high waves. 9 other ships were damaged. And several dozen aircraft were pushed overboard from their aircraft carriers. Tragically, 790 sailors lost their lives because of the storm. The worst news of December came on December 16th when German ground forces pulled off a surprise attack against the Allied forces resting in the forested Ardennes region in Belgium. The attack was designed to encircle and defeat the 4 U.S. armies and then take control of the key Allied port at Antwerp, thus stopping the resupply line. The Allies were unprepared for the attack, thinking that the Germans would never attempt to cross the hilly Ardennes, especially in such poor weather. The heavily overcast weather helped the Germans conceal their movement and achieve a total surprise offensive. The sudden attack, which included 410,000 German soldiers, 1,400 tanks, 1,000 aircraft, and 2,600 artillery weapons, almost worked. In the early days and weeks of the battle, the Germans advanced far enough into the Allied positions to create a large bulge 50 miles long and 70 miles deep into the Allied lines, hence the name Battle of the Bulge. In the early days of the attack, the Germans pulverized many U.S. forces. Maurice Kent of Martinsville, Indiana, assigned to the Army's 29th Infantry Division, was among the surprised U.S. forces in Belgium. He was badly injured in the fight. He recalled being bogged down in his foxhole from the German artillery and tanks and thinking that the shells from German 88s were getting closer. Next thing he knew, he woke up in a Belgian field hospital with no dog tags, no pack, and no .45 pistol or helmet. The impact from a German 88 shell had exploded, damaging his nose, jaw, he lost most of his teeth, and feet. He wouldn't walk again on his own for over 2 years. He eventually recovered and lived a long life until his death in 2019. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces took thousands of American soldiers as POWs. Over 23,500 Allied soldiers and airmen were eventually captured by the Germans and became prisoners of war. Scott Thompson of Folsomville, Indiana, was among the thousands of Allied soldiers captured by the Germans. He recalled in an interview, "On Christmas Day, we were prisoners and we were put on trains to be taken back to Germany. The Germans marched us to the nearest railroad and loaded us on a 40x8 boxcar. The weather had cleared, and the American Army Air Force had begun attacking all German trains. Our boxcars were strafed, and I remember looking out the boxcar window and seeing bullets striking the ground, as close as 30 to 40 feet from us. We, both the prisoners and Germans, piled out of the cars and formed a huge human cross to show we were prisoners. I guess the guards let us do this because they didn't want to be shot at either. End quote. Surviving his close call with death turned out to be a sign of hopeful deliverance for both Thompson and others who had been captured, but that deliverance would take several months. Thompson was confined to Stalag 4B, one of the larger German prisoner of war camps located in the province of Saxony, about 5 miles from the town of Mühlberg. Stalag, a shortened form of the German word Stammlager, meant main camp. Most of the prisoners at Stalag 4B were Americans. At its peak, it held over 30,000 prisoners of war in crowded conditions meant for far fewer prisoners. There, Thompson and the other POWs endured cold weather and hunger. They were eventually freed by advancing Soviet forces in April 1945. While Thompson languished in Stalag 4B, a tense standoff between U.S. and German forces took place in the critical crossroads Belgian town of Bastogne, shown in the blue arrow at the bottom of the map. On December 22, 1944, General Heinrich von Leutwitz, commander of the German army that had surrounded Bastogne, dispatched a party of 4 German soldiers under a flag of truce to deliver an ultimatum of surrender to General McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division that was holding out at Bastogne. When General McAuliffe received the German message, he read it, crumpled it into a ball, threw it in a waste paper basket, and muttered, "Aw, nuts." The official reply was typed and delivered to the German delegation. It read, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." The confused German major asked what the message meant. The American who delivered the message said, in plain English, "Go to hell." The outnumbered and beleaguered American units, augmented by the 101st Airborne Division, stood their ground, and the fight continued. They successfully held out until elements of General Patton's Third Army arrived on the scene with his tanks on December 26th. The arrival of the Third Army assured victory for the Allies in Bastogne. With the securing of Bastogne, the German forces were prevented from using the vital crossroads. For his actions at Bastogne, McAuliffe was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross by Lieutenant General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, on December 30th, 1944. Today, you'll find a statue of General McAuliffe next to an American Sherman tank in Bastogne's main town square. The Battle of the Bulge raged on for the rest of December and into January. During most of the first week of combat, December 16th to the 23rd, the weather had been overcast and the Allied bombers stranded on the ground. But the weather began to clear on December 23rd. Paul Maves of Lyons, Illinois, he later moved to Indianapolis, remembered well the weather change. He was a B-26 bombardier with the 572nd Squadron in the 391st Bomb Group of the 9th Air Force Division. The welcome clearing weather at first brought tragedy to the 9th Air Force. Saturday, December 23, 1944 became known as Black Saturday in the 9th Air Force history. On that awful day, 36 of the B-26 aircraft were lost to enemy fire while taking out important railway bridges in the back of the Ardennes battlefront. Of those 36 aircraft, 16 were from Maves' 391st Bomb Group. There was a very subdued Christmas Eve service that evening at the Squadron Chapel. Maves remembered the original plans called for a choir of men to lead in singing some of the Christmas carols, but many of those choir members had been killed in the previous day's tragedy, so there was no choir for the service. It was the saddest and most subdued Christmas Eve service that I had ever attended, remembered Maves. Maves and the rest of his crew had to put the tragedy behind them quickly as they flew consecutive missions the next 3 days, the 24th, the 25th, and the 26th. The 391st Bomb Group's missions were directed in support of the Allied infantry effort to push back the Germans and regain control of Belgium. For the next several weeks, the squadrons went on bomb runs to attack the German forces. Karl Marsch of Indianapolis also recalled the clearing weather that December. Marsch was an armorer with the 9th Air Force, 584th Squadron, 394th Bomb Group. His unit was near Cambrai, France, only 25 miles from the Belgian border. For the next several weeks, his squadron worked hard in bitterly cold weather to keep flight operations going in support of the frontline fighting. This meant around-the-clock loading of bombs on the B-26 bombers. With the extremely low temperatures, it also meant weapons had to be routinely maintained and vehicle engines run every half hour or so to prevent their oil from congealing. Marsch recalled being bitterly cold and sleeping with all his clothes on each night in the makeshift barracks. Aerial bombardment helped the Allied cause considerably as the infantry began pushing back against the Germans' previous advance. The combined air and infantry assault against the Germans worked, stemming the advance of the Nazis. During the almost 2 months of battle, U.S. forces suffered 81,000 casualties, 800 tanks were destroyed, and 1,000 aircraft were lost. The Battle of the Bulge became the Army's largest and most costly battle of the war. Much of the Ardennes forest in Belgium still appears as it did 80 years ago. Today you can still see the remnants of foxholes dug out and used by the American forces. Memorials to U.S. forces in Belgium are scattered throughout the region, testifying to the gratitude of Belgian citizens for U.S. involvement in freeing them from Nazi occupation. Another devastating surprise occurred on December 24th in the English Channel. Mooresville, Indiana resident Loren Wright, part of the Army's 66th Infantry Division, 262nd Regiment, was dangerously close to the tragedy. On the evening of December 24th, 1944, his regiment was divided in half and boarded 2 British troop transports, the SS Cheshire and the SS Leopoldville, which would carry the men across the English Channel and deliver them to Cherbourg, France. The 66th Division was slotted to augment troops already engaged in the Battle of the Bulge. During the crossing, a German U-boat fired on and sank the SS Leopoldville. There were 2,235 American troops on board the Leopoldville, among them 1/2 of Wright's 262nd Regiment. 802 American soldiers of the 66th Division perished, either by going down with the ship or dying of injury or hypothermia while awaiting rescue in the frigid waters. Loren Wright said, "I happened to be on the other ship," with both a mixture of gratitude and sadness. When the men finally learned that their sister transport ship had been sunk, they were given strict orders not to write home about the tragedy or ever to speak to others about it. The imposed secret saddened Wright for the rest of his life. The Allied commanders feared that the reaction of the American public to the sinking would have an adverse effect on the war effort. Details of the sinking remained classified by the War Department until 1958. Wright survived the war and lived a long life, passing in 2017. Adding to the national grief in December, famous and well-loved band leader U.S. Army Major Glenn Miller perished in a missing plane incident over the English Channel on December 15th. He was on his way to Paris to schedule concerts for the troops. All these events put a heavy damper on the normally festive holiday season and reminded the Americans that the war was far from over. Learn more about World War II history during 1944 and the stories of those who served in my World War II trilogy, Our Service, Our Stories, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. The books are available for purchase on my website, ronaldpmay.com. To contact me for questions or to schedule me for a speaking engagement, email me at ron@ronaldpmay.com. Also, be sure to check out all my other videos on my YouTube channel at World War II History and Stories with Ron May. You will find a link to my videos on the YouTube tab from the homepage of my website. Please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Thanks for tuning into this episode. Please share it with others who you think may be interested. See you next month for our episode 13, featuring the events and stories of January 1945 on World War II at 80.